Okay, so I think we'll make a start. Firstly, hello, my name is Natalie Gardner. I'm the Associate Dean for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion in the Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health. And a very, very warm welcome to today's session. It's our faculty's International Women's Day Keynote talk. And I'm so delighted that Nazir is able to be here today and deliver the talk to us. It's a real honour and I appreciate your time. On here you can see the plan for today's event. There'll be a talk, there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers towards the end of the session, and I'm just going to quickly go over a few of the housekeeping issues ahead of the event today. So we've got no fire alarm schedule, so if a big noise happens we have to leave by our nearest exit down the stairs and exit the building. We are recording the lecture today, so people can be aware of that. And personal filming of the event is not permitted. You are welcome and encouraged to join the conversation. Social media use the hashtag #EmbraceEquity, International Women's Day tag. In the question and answer session later, we would really appreciate it. There'll be some roving microphones going around. So we'd appreciate it if you could wait until you have a microphone before you ask a question. That means everyone can hear it and it will also be picked up on the recording. If anyone's brought donations for the Manchester Food Bank today, thank you very much. There'll be a box available at the place where the refreshments are later if you've still got some to drop off. Finally, due to the nature of the talk, it's likely that some sensitive topics may be raised and they may be upsetting, so I'd like us all to just be mindful and respectful of each other. And I'd also like to flag the university's report and support platform in case anyone has any issues they'd like to sort of raise or talk to anybody about. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much, and I'm going to pass over to Dr. Beth Micakovic, who's our new Faculty Director of Operations, who joined us last October, and I will pass over to you to introduce Nazir.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone, and particularly welcome to Beth Malida, who is a guest of Nazir's today and has joined us particularly to listen to this talk, so thank you very much for coming. I don't think that I will be alone when I say I've had mixed feelings about International Women's Day this year. There have been times over the last year and more when I have felt absolute despair at the erosion of rights of women across the world. It has made me seriously question the progress we thought we'd made over the last century in the advance of civil liberties. In the United States, we have seen women's rights to exercise agency over their bodies and health stripped away. In Iran, women have borne unthinkable violence for their visible allyship and protesting against the death of Mahsa Amini whilst in police custody. And in Afghanistan, the brutal rescinding of basic education rights to women and girls, which will have a direct impact on women and child mortality, let alone mental health of a generation. These events, coupled with the daily assaults and onslaught of misogyny towards women and girls on social media, should stimulate a moment of reflection at the very least. But it can be difficult amidst the grief of these events to distill clearly what has motivated this degree of trespass over the last couple of years. But for me, it comes down to one thing, and that's fear. Equality is too often seen as a zero-sum game. With respect to women, the perception of being that if one gender advances, the other must lose out. It is fear that privileged structures to be challenged, that more women will take their legitimate place in the world and be disruptors. But fear is a chaotic emotion, and it triggers chaotic responses, and the sort of responses that we have seen over the last few years. International Women's Day should be an event characterised by celebration, because it is a day in which we celebrate fearlessness. It is where we celebrate fierceness. It celebrates the power of the global community of women, who, through collective allyship and advocacy, display that fearlessness to break boundaries, to destigmatise the discussion of once taboo topics, and above all, the fearlessness to have their voices heard on their fundamental rights to education, to equitable healthcare, to agency. They speak with fierce reason, but as many have said in chorus, this is not a women-only fight, and the voices of our male allies are pivotal in driving forward change. In our speaker today, I cannot think of a more visible, more fearless, more fierce ally for women. Over a career spanning 30 years, he has prosecuted the most high-profile cases in the country, advised on many others, and led nationally on several legal topics, including violence against women and girls, child sexual abuse, and honour-based violence, with responsibility for more than 100,000 prosecutions each year. His role in the convictions of the Rochdale grooming gang and hundreds of others were groundbreaking and changed the landscape of child protection. More recently, he's chaired the independent review of the London Fire Brigade, which uncovered institutional misogyny and racism. He was awarded the first ever Disruptive for Good award at the Northern Power Women Awards in 2022, having received his OBE in 2005 in recognition of his work. By no means an exhaustive list of his accomplishments, our speaker today is quite simply a legend. It is an absolute privilege to introduce our Chancellor, Nazir Afzal, who will be talking today on fighting for gender equity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Beth, and that was really quite touching. I am touched. Thank you so much. I should say at the outset, it's a real immense privilege to be Chancellor of this great institution. And you know, it wasn't even a dream to be Chancellor of this institution, so I feel very, very honoured really to have this role for the next 6 years, 5 months. I'm just counting. But I don't speak to you today as Chancellor because I think it's important to say that I don't want the university to be having to answer for some of the things I might say. So I think I should make that clear. Nor do I speak to you as the first independent chair of the Catholic Church's safeguarding agency, regulator of the Catholic Church, this good Muslim boy from Birmingham. Nor do I speak to you as the press standards regulator, and nor do I speak to you in any other role they may have. But I do speak to you as, firstly, the patron of 9 women-led charities that work in protecting and supporting women who are suffering abuse. And that it really is an immense privilege that that's happened. I do speak to you on the basis of having spoken to thousands of victims who honoured me by sharing their stories. And I speak to you, first and foremost, as a man. Because I need to recognise, and I think the men in this room need to recognise, that the reason why we have violence against women and girls is because of us. More than 90% of violence against women and girls is carried out by men. Additionally, more than 90% of violence against men is carried out by men. So do we not know what the problem is then? The problem, of course, is male violence. And it's been touched on a moment ago by Beth. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's about misogyny. It's about sexism. It's about entitlement. It's about power. And it's about control. All the things that we men have had for centuries, thousands of years for that matter, and feel that that enables us to do what we want to whomever we want. And as Beth touched on a moment ago, it is really challenging times. Why would you have confidence in the police, for example, when 2 years and 1 week ago, Sarah Everard was detained by a serving police officer who then raped her, murdered her, and then tried to burn her body? Why would you have faith and confidence in the police when another serving police officer, David Carrick, was convicted of the rape of 12 women over 20 years? And then when you look at the data and the statistics, 1% of reports to police lead to a conviction. 1% of sexual offence reports to police lead to conviction. That means 99% go nowhere. And then, as you will undoubtedly know, most people don't even report to police. So that's 1% of those who report, but a pretty non-existent, negligible figure compared to those who've actually suffered harm. 2 women every week in this country are murdered by their partners or ex-partners. 10 women every week in this country take their own lives because of domestic abuse that they're suffering. 1 in 4 women suffer domestic abuse. 1 in 5 women suffer sexual assault. 97%, according to the most recent survey, of women say that they have suffered sexual harassment. I bet that's 100%. The other 3% probably just didn't recognise what was happening. That is the pandemic that will outlive the pandemic that we've just been through. And yet we do not have anything like the level of emergency response that you would imagine they would need. It's dealt with, as it's always been dealt with, as a woman's safety issue. Do you remember what happened in the immediate aftermath of Sarah's murder? The government announced more money for street lighting. So you can see the guy that's going to abuse you. The government announced that you would all get rape alarms. So you can call for help when you are being attacked. Rather than dealing with the actual cause, which is the fact that men feel entitled, that men commit these crimes and men commit these behaviours. And that's why it's important on this day, International Women's Day, that when we celebrate, and we are celebrating my mother, my sister, my wife, my daughter, all the friends and colleagues that I know who've made my life as fulfilled as it has been. While we celebrate all of that, we must also recognise the challenges that we face across society, not just here, but around the world. And Beth touched on it. If you're in Afghanistan right now, you can't go to school. You can't go to university. And I was taken, I'm sure some of you were, by the male university students to stop going. They were thinking, well, it devalues my degree that these other women can't complete their studies. And then when you have a situation where women in Iran are being persecuted because they don't want to wear hijab, and women in France and Belgium are being persecuted because they do want to wear hijab, the reality is it comes down, does it not, to choice. But the women are not being permitted across the world. Beth touched also on what's happening in the United States. Women across the world are being told, you can't choose. That we, the men, must choose for you. And if you do choose, there'll be consequences that flow from that. When Beth was giving you my figures, i.e. what I prosecuted, etc., two things she didn't tell you. When I left prosecuting in 2015, I had prosecuted more femicides, murders of women, than anybody in this country. When I finished prosecuting, I had prosecuted more honour-based killings than anybody in the world. And that gives you a sense of what I've had to deal with. I've sat with the families of the deceased, and I've listened to their pain. And I've listened to what they think could have happened if somebody had done something. And that somebody, they generally mean some man somewhere that could have stood up. When you read about Sarah Everard's killer, I don't use his name, it's not worth it. When I mentioned his killer, other officers called him rapey in the office. Yeah? Well, what do you do with that information? Yeah? And when he was indecently exposing himself, as he did 4 days before he murdered Sarah Everard, nothing came of it. So this is what I mean, is that it doesn't happen in a vacuum. And Beth also mentioned my independent report that I completed into London Fire Brigade, which I published at the end of November. I found that institution, which is a brilliant institution in terms of what it does, but I found it was, and it's the first time it's ever happened in this country, an institution that was institutionally misogynist. Female firefighters were telling me that they didn't feel safe. That they were told on a regular basis by colleagues, male colleagues, that if they spoke up about the way they're being treated, there'd be consequences. One female fighter said that her oxygen was being tampered with. So the workplace wasn't just safe from banter or from abuse, it was not safe. Full stop. And then when that report came out, apart from the fact that suddenly people woke up to the subject, I have been inundated with hundreds of firefighters, invariably female, from up and down the country, and in fact around the world, telling me, look at me please, look at us as well. Well, this young man in Manchester doesn't have the resources to look at absolutely everybody. But I've used every opportunity I can to make the point that this is a national and international issue, and not one that should just focus on London Fire Brigade. That's the easy thing to do. It happens with policing as well. You're going to see Louise Casey's report into the culture of the Metropolitan Police in about 10 days' time. And it will not surprise you at what she found. But people will be going, look at them, don't look at us. What you need to do, what we need to do, is look at everybody. because you can rest assured that if there's a problem with misogyny in one place, it's everywhere. It's in society. It's in every home, place of work, institution, you name it. It's there. And despite the progress, you know, I tweeted this morning about one of my privileges being now a citizen of Manchester, is that Manchester was the home of the suffragette movement. This is where the right to a vote for women in this country and then worldwide came. Manchester. Manchester is the home of the cooperative movement worldwide. Rochdale, but Rochdale's still part of Greater Manchester, despite their attempt to distance themselves. This morning on Twitter they did try. It is Manchester. And the cooperative movement is what gave women economic rights. Manchester, not far from here, is where the Peterloo massacre took place. You probably didn't know this. Women were murdered or killed for any human abuse that day, protesting for parliamentary reform. Manchester has been the home of social activism. Manchester has been the home of fighting for women's basic rights. So it's an immense privilege to be here and living in Manchester. And that's something we should be so proud of. But it also means that we must continue that fight. That we cannot allow the people that I've had to deal with, that I have seen, suffering, and the others that we don't see that are suffering. When I saw the data 3 years ago, the Office for National Statistics, which is our government statistical body, independent, said that at least 3.1 million adults in this country were sexually abused as children. So I repeat that. At least 3.1 million adults. That means that 1 in 20 British citizens were sexually abused as children. It wasn't all by brown people from Rochdale. Some people would love you to believe that. 84% of sex offenders are British white men. Let's put the context around these things. But this is the nature of the problem. But it's important to rewind and talk about how I got to where I am today. So when I became a prosecutor a long time ago now, one of my first roles was first contact for the paedophile unit of New Scotland Yard, where I worked in London. And that was an opportunity for me to guide and assist police officers whose job, we all think we've got a hard job. Imagine what it's like, going in 8 o'clock in the morning, spending 12 hours looking at indecent images of children being raped, because you want to identify the victim, you want to identify the perpetrator, you want to identify what crime patterns, etc., etc. You go home at 8 o'clock to your family, you get up the next morning, and you do the same thing again. You know, I was always in awe. So I've talked to bad police officers. I'm talking here about good police officers and doing their job as they did. But one of the cases I came across, you're all adults, and forgive me, and you have the trigger warning, was a case involving a camcorder. Do you remember camcorders? So a father was raping the 18-month-old baby whilst the mother was filming it. And to prepare the case, obviously I had to examine the evidence that included the film. She was arguing that she was under duress. So I had to watch the film to show that she was a willing partner. I had an 18-month-old daughter at that time, so I went home and hugged my daughter more tightly and realized that I didn't have a job anymore, I had a mission. Nobody should have to suffer as that young child did, or any child had to. And it wasn't going to be possible, just prosecuting one case at a time, to change the landscape. It needed policy. It needed specialisms. It needed new guidelines. It needed a completely new approach. And so when I had the opportunity, and I became Chief Prosecutor in London in 2001, I realized the thing that was most important to me was the experiences of victims and survivors, because we never listened to them. We thought as lawyers, we knew best. We know the law and we know what evidence is. But actually, the thing we need to do more of was to start engaging with victims and survivors. And I had the opportunity then to tell people to do that. Prior to that, I had no opportunity. They wouldn't listen to me. Now I was the chief, so I could. And so I remember we had a knife crime epidemic in London 20-odd years ago. I told my teams, right, go out and talk to young people who are impacted by knife crime. And they said, yeah, let's invite them to our offices. Guess what? Nobody came. I said, you misunderstood the let's go out bit. We go to them. And so I said, I'll lead by example. So I remember going up a bookmaker's in Harlesden, North London, and there were 40 young men, all wearing bandanas across their faces, and they're talking to me about why they carry a knife. And they carry a knife, this is their explanation, because of the environment they lived in, their poor schooling, poor policing, poor education, drugs, you name it, everything that you could think of. And I learnt more in that conversation than I learnt in any conversation about violent crime. So much so that I went back to the Home Office at a time when the Home Office used to listen, and I sat with them and I explained this to them, and we developed together, with the survivors, with victims, with families, the first ever serious violent crime strategy. Best informed by the people most impacted by this. I thought, well, hang on, if it works for knife crime, why can't it work for violence against women and girls? So I literally opened the door. I said, right, any NGO who works in this field, tell me what's going on. Because so much of what we deal with is hidden in plain sight. But we just don't know. The state doesn't know. The state deals with the case, the consequence. It doesn't deal with anything more than that. And I was inundated, in a nice way, with organisations of stalking victims, saying, Nazir, you don't understand that when that person's following me, I'm a prisoner in my own home. And you prosecute him for a low-level offence of following me. You don't appreciate the impact. I said, now I do. So we introduced the first ever guidelines for tackling stalking. So we did this over and over again. And then forced marriage and all-based abuse. Charity came to see me and said, look, we're dealing with hundreds of women every year who are forced into marriage by their families and their communities. And I said, what do you mean forced? They said they're brutalised. They're beaten. They are threatened with death if they don't pursue this. I said, I didn't know this. I didn't know this. Why would I? I'm a man, but I didn't know this. So I said, what I can do, and this is one of our powers, one of anybody's powers, is convene. And so I said, I'll organise a conference for you that will enable you to talk to the influential people. And I said, I'll organise it in London. I'll organise it near Parliament to enable parliamentarians to come. And of course, parliamentarians told me they were really all busy. And so I did something which I'd never done before. I organised it in a hotel right opposite Parliament. And I said to them, don't come all day, just come for 10, 15 minutes. Pop in. And to their credit, many of them did. And they listened, as I did, to these stories of survivors who had been threatened with acid, or who had acid thrown at them, who'd been killed. Families told me that loved ones had been killed, etc. And once I'd heard these stories, I couldn't get it out of my head. It's not enough to listen. You've got to act upon what you've heard. And so I sat down again with the Home Office that listened, 2004, not 23. We created a working group of all the government departments. I can't begin to tell you the people around that table. Every department was represented. And we defined the term. If you Google honour-based abuse, that term we defined back in 2004. And once I defined it, and this is the thing you as academics, most of you will know, you need data. And we had no data. And so I went into my top pocket. The police owe me some stuff here. Right. I said to the Met, can you go through your homicides last year using this definition and identify how many of them were honour killings? And they said, okay, we'll do that. And they did. And they came back and said, in 2004, Nazir, 12 women were killed in the name of honour in the UK. I said, right, I've got data. And I went with that data to the Home Office, and they said, oh my God, it's a problem, massive problem. So what do we do about it? We introduced specialist prosecutors. We introduced specialist police teams. We introduced legislative change. And legislative change does not happen just like that. And worse when it's a private member's bill. The government at the time were very busy with the Middle East. Well, I won't say any more than that. And they weren't keen. Well, I said the one thing that would save women's lives was something called a protection order. A forced marriage protection order. We didn't have any of the time, any protection order at the time, but a forced marriage one. One that would enable a victim or somebody on behalf of the victim to go to a court and say, this person's at risk, we need these conditions in place. And the court, so we persuaded a parliamentarian to put it into Parliament, but because it's a private member's bill, those of you who know Parliament, rarely ever become law. Sometimes the emotional case, the moral case, the legal case isn't good enough. Sometimes pervasive is the business case. And what I did was this. Do you know how much it costs to prosecute one homicide? Back then, it was £1 million. It's now £1.5 million. So I went to the Attorney General and I said, Attorney General, you're telling me that I'm hearing but the reason why the government will not support this legislation is because it will cost £2 million a year. I said, if we reduce the number of murders by 2, we pay for it. And he said, you promised me that, I will support it. And they supported it. And it became a government bill, and it became law. The Forced Marriage Civil Protection Act 2007 was passed. Since that legislation, so in the 15 years since, more than 4,500 protection orders have been issued. That is more than 4,500 lives that have been saved. 1.5 million each, they owe me big time. It's never going to come my way, it doesn't matter. The point is, sometimes you need to use every lever that you have at your disposal. But it was necessary to work together with the NGOs on that. They have the skill set. When people tell me, Nazir, you're an expert on, I'm not an expert on anything. I know people who are. And being able to give them access to people who can bring the power. But then I have to do something else, and this is about male allies. It's not enough to expect somebody else to raise awareness. So, as has been said, I'm responsible for 150,000 prosecutions a year back then. But I have great teams. So let them do the prosecuting, escalate appropriately to me. I'm going to raise awareness. And if you have if you go to a band and you have a T-shirt with all the places the band plays, my T-shirt from 2008 will be the Royal College of GPs, the Royal College of Midwives, the Local Government Association, Coroners Society of England and Wales. I went everywhere. Children's Society, local authorities, I went everywhere and scared the living daylights out of them. And how do you do that? You tell them stories. You tell them that Roxana Naz was murdered by her mother whilst her brother held her down because she was pregnant with her boyfriend's baby. And then when the mother was asked in the witness box, why did your daughter have to die? She said it was her kismet. It was her destiny. When Heshu Yolson, a 16-year-old girl, was murdered by her father in West London, she was murdered because her father found out she had a boyfriend. How did her father find out she had a boyfriend? The school rang him up and said, your daughter was not in school yesterday. Was it anything to do with her boyfriend? No training, no awareness, no recognition of the risk. So you scare people. Do you want to be that school? Do you want to be that institution, that body? And to their credit, without exception, all of them accepted the roles and brought in national guidelines to tackle this. We came to a situation in 2008 where we came from no knowledge in 2004 to the highest conviction rate in our history, and even more, amazingly, the Americans came to me and said, Nazir, this is world leading. Can we learn from you? And for the Americans to think that we're world leading in something is something, isn't it? And so off to New York I went to explain whatever to them. Strangely, those visits to America stopped in November 2016. I don't know who was elected then that didn't want to hear from a Muslim anymore, but by the by. But we changed the world. Britain changed the world when it came to forced marriage, honour-based abuse. And we brought in a national hotline, and we gave people an opportunity to share their experiences, and we worked across the piece, and we talked about failure. Failure is really important to talk about. Banaz, young girl called Banaz Mahmood, forced marriage at 16, brutalised for 2 years by her husband, ready to report her husband, goes to her mum and dad and says, oh, I need to come home, otherwise I'll report him for rape. Oh, that was a great shame to us. Oh, come home. Reluctantly, they allow her home. A year later, she's seen kissing her boyfriend, her new boyfriend, outside of a tube station in South London. Some busybody tells her family, father and uncle decide with a group of men, Banaz must die for the shame that she's brought to her family, and she's abducted off the streets of London. She's raped by one of those who ultimately kill her. And we know why? Because we put a listening device in his phone. He said, I raped her because I wanted her to know who was in control before she died. Who was in control? Easy peasy prosecuting father and uncle and the other man. But there were other men involved. We knew there were multiple men, up to 8 men involved in that decision making. It wasn't enough to just prosecute those 3. Sometimes it's about messaging to send a wider message. And we found 2 of them in Iraq. They fled to Iraq post-Saddam, and they were celebrating how they'd restored the honour of this family. And we went to the Iraqi government and said, I know we haven't got an extradition treaty with you. This is really important to us. And they said, get them on the plane. And they came back, and we prosecuted them. And now, today, 2023, 5 men are in prison for life for the murder of a 19-year-old girl for kissing her boyfriend outside of a tube station. That's the horrors of all of this. The reality is, but she could have been saved. On one occasion, Bernard was at home when her father walks in with marigold gloves on and a bottle of brandy and says, "Drink this," and she wasn't a drinker. And she realises something up, she smashes the window and runs down the street, goes up to a woman police officer, and the woman police officer smells the alcohol on her breath, the blood on her hands, and threatens to arrest her for drunken disorderly behaviour. On another occasion, she's at the police station when they are taking her seriously, and she hands over a list of the 5 men that she says will kill her. And the officer says, "We'll get back to you." And that's racism. Pure racism. Not taking something very seriously. So it's misogyny and racism. Intersectionality of everything you can possibly imagine, but total failure. And that's the kind of conversation you need to have with people that will change them. And it does change them. We changed everything around that subject. It was touched on, I haven't got a great deal of time, but Rochdale grooming gang was mentioned in the opening, and that was obviously here, so not far from here. And I arrived here in May of 2011, knowing nobody but Pervez's sister in the whole of the north of England. Literally one person I knew, and I thought I was coming for an easy life. Right? Because when I was working in London, I was leaving for work before my children woke up, and I was coming back after they'd gone to sleep, and I thought, I'm not having any quality of life. And I'll get one up here. God. I arrived in 2011, the riots, remember those? Steppy Hill Hospital, the nurse killing patients, house soldiers killing burglars, you name it. I had a phenomenal baptism of fire. But then there was the grooming gangs. And the Times newspaper had been covering the story, but they said that nothing's being done about this. And I said to my teams, do we have something like this? Do we have a case of sexual abuse of children that is not being addressed? And they said, Nazir, we did have. In 2008, a young girl goes into a takeaway restaurant in Rochdale. She starts smashing it up. Police arrive, arrest her, and then she reports to the police that she's been raped by these men. The officers carry out a ridiculously poor investigation. 11 months, where they really made their mind up from day one. She's from a very troubled background, very chaotic background. You know, any excuse to not believe her. And they went to 2 prosecutors. Well, if you don't believe her, we don't believe her, no jury's going to believe her. End of the case. But it wasn't, because 46 other girls being abused after that particular girl. 47 girls were now abused by the time it came to me when I arrived here in 2011. Because those men could act with impunity. They thought the state weren't interested in them because the state weren't interested in these girls. Because of their background, they're in the care system, whatever it may be, all the reasons. And they said, Nazir, the problem we've got now prosecuting is a simple one. How do we say to a jury, members of the jury, this girl is telling the truth? Well, we didn't believe her, but now we believe her. Well, the jury going to say, well, that's reasonable doubt, isn't it? I said, well, this is what we do, Nazir. I said to my team, this is what we do. We admit we got it wrong. You can imagine the silence in the room. No institution admits they got anything wrong. I said, no, we got it wrong. She's always been the right. We got it wrong. And by the way, I'm the chief. That's what we're going to do. So we went into court. We put that before the jury. Those men were convicted. 9 men were convicted of the abuse of 47 girls over many, many years. And BBC filmed 3 girls. Anybody seen that? That's this case. And the actor playing me is much more handsome than I am. I'll take that. But that case then opened up an enormous amount of discourse. And all of it misguided. The focus was entirely on the ethnicity of the perpetrators. Not the fact that there was a cohort, tens of thousands of young girls in this country who were just not being believed. Who were being targeted and not being believed. That was the issue. So I wrote about it extensively. I remember getting a phone call from somebody called David Cameron, I don't know if you know him, and he said, Nazir, would you explain what's going on? Yes, in very simple ABC terms. I did. We are not taking abuse seriously, and we're not listening to victims, and we're not listening particularly to young girls from troubled backgrounds, impoverished, deprived communities. And I thought I was changing the narrative, and then something happened that I wasn't ready for, and I wasn't expecting. The far right realized that I damaged their narrative. What was their narrative? All brown black people are rapists. But the only reason they were convicted was because of this brown person. So I damaged their narrative. And then they come for me. And I prosecuted serious organised crime 20 odd years by then, the most horrible people you can probably imagine, but they never came to my door. Suddenly, I had the far right outside of my door, trying to break into my house. I had the police, GMP to their credit, put a police officer outside of my front door for 2 weeks, because that was to keep me safe. I tell my kids who were early teens, the Prime Minister's got a police officer outside his door. It was the way I could reassure them. I had to have panic alarms placed in every room in my house, so my kids, and I had to teach them how to use it in case we were attacked. They could only go to school in a taxi for 4 months, because that was the advice, security advice I was given. In 1 week alone, me and my teams got 17,000 letters and emails calling for me to be sacked and deported. Now, I come from Birmingham, I'd love to go back there, but I don't. Right? 17,000, including, and I only survived for 2 reasons. One, my networks, my staff. They were phenomenal. I remember my PA running down the corridor with a letter full of shit, literally. Don't show it to him, don't tell him. They shielded me from the worst excesses of what was being thrown up. And then it was my leader, my manager, somebody called Keir Starmer, I don't know if you heard of him. Something happened. I didn't know about this, and I didn't know about it until afterwards. Keir told my teams, Nazir will no longer be having meetings at 9 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon because he has to do the school run. Nazir will not be going to national conferences. I didn't even know why I wasn't being invited. Because he needs to be at home and not away from home at this time. He needs to be there. That's leadership. That's male allyship. Recognition that I needed protection at a time of that. But the other thing it did was it emboldened me. So we set up a national panel. We made sure that everybody in the whole country referred those cases. If we got one wrong, how many others we got wrong? And we started putting them right. And we started bringing justice when we could do. But there are 2 stories that I'll finish with, which really explain the impact of this. First was in the Stuart Hall case, the BBC presenter. He was found guilty of the abuse of 11 women and girls going back many, many decades. And he was found not guilty of 1. And this woman, now in her late 30s, had been abused, she said, when she was a child. And I went to see her afterwards, and I said, I'm really sorry that I couldn't give you closure. And she looked me in the eyes and said, you gave me closure the moment you believed me. And I thought, hang on a minute, I'm so fixated on process, thinking that the court process, the judicial outcome is what mattered. No, what mattered is that somebody listened and believed. And then about a year ago, I have the shittiest website in the world, don't go on it. It has a contact page though, and that comes to me, please don't email. But I got this email, and it said, Dear Mr. Afzal, you won't remember me, I was one of the victims of Stuart Hall. I now have terminal cancer, I only have a few weeks to live, but I wanted you to know that my life began when you convicted Stuart Hall. And I thought, how do I respond? Do I say thank you? That's not enough, is it? It's not good enough. So I sent her my phone number, and I spoke to her. And she explained to me, for 30-odd years, nobody had believed her. This powerful man and her, nobody believed her. Everybody treated her with disdain. Suddenly, when people believed her, she could begin her life. And she could recover. And she did recover. And the last thing she wanted to tell me, the last thing she told me on the first surface of this earth, was to tell me what a difference that had made to her life and what impact you have. That's male allyship. That's about standing up and recognizing the impact of what we do. We've got to ensure that we educate our way out of this. Absolutely educate our way out. It's too late by the time, when I gave up prosecuting, I gave it up for a good reason. That every time any case came to me, somebody had been harmed. I want to prevent harm. We want to prevent harm. We want a situation where people don't get hurt, don't get raped, don't get abused, don't get treated in the ways that we all know happens. And so how do we do that? We do that as early as possible. When you are born, you hate nothing, maybe broccoli, but generally you hurt nothing. What you hate is learnt behavior. So in the same way that hate is learnt behavior, so can be tolerance, acceptance, love, caring. All those things can be learnt. But we don't do that early enough. We wait to high school, by which time they've already made up their minds about what happens. I remember a 21-year-old boy saying to me, man, a few years ago, you don't understand, he said. You don't understand. He said, man is a piece of gold and woman is a piece of silk, he said. And I thought, that sounds quite Nice, very poetic. He goes, if you drop a piece of gold in mud, you can wipe it clean. If you drop a piece of silk in mud, it's stained forever. Born, educated in this country, and yet he believes that women's choices mean they are stained forever. That's where education comes in. That's why we need to understand, or young people need to understand, abusive relationships, understand signs, understand power and control. And men and boys need to understand good relationships and power and control and all the things. And we're struggling right now. We could do a long discussion on masculinity. There are two schools. There's a school that says to be a man, you need to be strong and powerful. There's another school that says to be a man, you need to be protective and empathetic. Why can't you be both? Or neither? Why do you have to be pigeonholed? And that's where we are right now, is that we seem to be fighting this. And whenever I talk about women's issues or women's rights, I always get a group of men coming back to me saying, what about male victims? Today is a classic example. You get this every 8th of March. Where's International Men's Day? Every day of the year, by the way, just in case anybody asks you that question. But that's the reality of it, is that there's a certain group of people, and by the way, the answer to them is just to sideline them. They're not important. Ignore them. The vast majority of people, those who feel you can change, they're the ones we need to engage with. And I tried to organise in 2016, and I don't think I've told this to anybody, but maybe I have. I tried to organise, it was a lot of million-man marches going on around the world in America. And I tried to organise a million-man march around this issue. And I got 52 sign-ups. So I'm 999,948 short, right? All right, okay, well, it's worth a try. I realise that's not the way to do it. But we've got to recognise our responsibility, men. Time and time again, when I talk about domestic abuse, violence against women, sexual violence, it's to an audience of 90% women. Time and time again. I struggle a little bit. When I do the Catholic Church one, it's all bishops and cardinals, so it's all men. But generally, apart from that example, it's 90% women. And that's why we're not even engaged in the conversation. Unless we're engaged in the conversation, we're not going to change things. And misogyny, what drives all of this, is something that requires that level of effort. I go back to what I said at the outset. The effort we put into the pandemic, that's the level. This is the pandemic. That will outlive that pandemic. This is where we need to put all this effort. Where's our vaccine for tackling violence against women and girls? Yeah? What more do we need to do? Where are these monthly, daily COBRA meetings? Yeah? Where are those WhatsApp messages? Right? We don't do enough. We don't take this seriously. We wait for the next murder, the next horrible crime. And we go, oh my God, how terrible this is. And we forget about it for a little while until the next one. Am I right? Yeah. But there's no sustained effort. And there's no international effort. There is CEDAW. There is an international treaty on this subject. There is legislation, regularly legislation, but it tinkers around the edges. There is none of this effort. And the only way it'll happen is if the men take responsibility. I beg you, find a way for you to be engaged in this subject. Because your daughters, your sisters, your friends, your colleagues need you to do this for them as much as for yourself. It has to be our effort. We can't allow, I'm privileged to be a patron of 9 different charities that work, and they're all women-led. But they spend 50% of their days fundraising. I'd rather they spend 100% of their days helping people. Wouldn't you? Yeah. But why is that? Because they seem to be doing it without the support of everybody else. And so we need to work together on this. And I'll finish with this, really, is that, I did a Desert Island Discs. You can go online and have a listen to it. And that's probably the pinnacle of my career, actually. And I was asked about my mother in that. And my mother passed away in the first few months of COVID, not from COVID, but she died from a broken heart, I'll put it bluntly, because my brother did die from COVID. And when I was visiting her, the short times that I had because of COVID restrictions, which I complied with, when I visited her, I would massage her feet. I told this to Desert Islanders. I'd massage her feet. And I realised she had really small feet. She had size 3 feet. I had spent my whole life not noticing that my mother had such small feet. And do you know why that was? Because she had the presence of a mountain. She was the rock in my life. And I didn't know that. And that's why we should celebrate women. Thank you very much indeed.
Can you hear me? Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. That was such an inspirational talk. I heard you when you came into office on Founders Day, and hairs on the back of my neck every time I hear you speak. Your stories are powerful and incredible. And we are honoured to have you as our Chancellor, genuinely. World-leading legend, definitely believe that. You epitomise the radical spirit. It's a core value of the University of Manchester. We're definitely claiming you as a Mancunian and one of our own region as well, and drive forward gender equality and gender-based violence against women and girls. So thank you again. Just to say, there is refreshments outside of this door, so can we leave the auditorium this way? That door will be closed. Have I forgotten anything else, Natalie?
No, all good.
Thank you. That's great. And thank you to the organisers, to Natalie, to Beth, to Jenny, etc. Thank you.